I'm John Hester. I'm one of the assistant city managers for the city of Reno, and I think that we've got one of the most exciting sessions of the whole summit today, this afternoon. We're going to try to touch on parts of all three tracks: mobility, economy, livability. And what's interesting, I think, about this session is that it talks about the concepts that you might see in a regional plan that's sort of nebulous, and brings it down to real life, to real projects, to how are we implementing this regional plan. This slide that you see up here shows you our Truckee Meadows services area. It's based on the population forecast and how much land we need. But another important concept in it is it shows transit-oriented development corridors. For those of you who know the area, the main north-south corridor is the old US 395, which has now been replaced by a freeway. And the main east-west line is old US 40, which has now been replaced by Interstate 80. In doing the regional plan, we realized that we had obsolete auto-oriented corridors, and we needed to do something about those for two reasons. One is to have those be revitalized as important parts of our cities, but also to absorb some of the development, because a lot of people in the public opinion polls did not want to see us continue to grow out as much as we had. So what you're going to hear about is the two first priority corridors here: South Virginia and East 4th Prater, the east-west corridors. We've got a great panel. We're going to start out with Dave Jickling from RTC, who's going to give you just a quick overview, or as he says, 30 seconds of insightful comments on how important these corridors are to the regional transportation system. Andy Durling is going to talk about the Complete Street project for Virginia and how that helps with pedestrian and other types of circulation. Cynthia Albright's going to follow that and talk about the queue jumping in stations that were going in place now for bus rapid transit, and that could lead into streetcar and light rail. And then Dave Davies and Rick Gustafson are going to talk about the streetcar and light rail study for South Virginia, where we are now. That'll be followed by another 30 seconds of insightful comments from me on intermodal transportation centers. Then Steve Knoll is going to tell us all about the transportation and event center project that's getting started for downtown Reno. Kyle West will then switch going east on the East 4th corridor, talk a little bit about what Reno's doing there. Armando Ornelas and Jim Rundle will talk about the award-winning transit-oriented development corridor plan that Sparks has done for the East 4th Prater corridor. And then Christina Leach will follow up with what RTC is planning for their plans for that corridor. Then we'll have time for some questions and dialogue. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dave for his 30 seconds.
Begin.
Time's up.
Okay. Thank you, John. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. If you're from this area, which I think most of the people in the room are, you're familiar with these two corridors. Virginia Street is 395. The old 395 connects Carson City and heads north as 395 goes up into California. And then, of course, 4th Street, Prater, the old Lincoln Highway, prior to I-80. When we talk about public transportation, one of the things we, particularly fixed route public transportation, which is the buses operating on schedules and routes, is you have to think density. In order for transit to work effectively, we need density, and both the Virginia Street corridor and the 4th Street Prater corridor have amongst the highest density of both employment and residential in our community. Therefore, not unexpectedly, that's where we serve transit very heavily. And in fact, these two corridors combined account for more than 25% of all the transit trips taken daily in our community, roughly about 6,000 trips. So naturally, as we look at these corridors and talk about transit-oriented development and livable communities, these are the two corridors in our community that have the most potential for future projects and growth and starting to do the kind of development that the Federal Transit Administration, the Housing Agency, are all looking at. And so the speakers that follow me will be talking to you about some of these projects that are looking to really develop what we all know as the core of the Reno-Sparks metropolitan area.
Thanks, David. The South Virginia Complete Street Project is really a supportive project to a lot of the projects that you'll hear to support the transit operations, the bus rapid transit, and other services on Virginia Street. Overall, the project encompasses from California Avenue at the northern extent to Gitski Lane at the southern extent. So basically from the edge of the downtown core south 3 miles to the convention center. Well, the overall goal for the project was to create a more attractive, walkable corridor that will attract people to spend time at the businesses and live in the areas adjacent. Currently, South Virginia is really a mixed bag of varied sidewalk widths and conditions. The street lights, there's been some pilot projects, but overall really not a cohesive street lighting master plan. There's a range of architectural styles as well as just varied upkeep of the properties along South Virginia Street. And then overall, there's really a lot of opportunities for redevelopment and infill. This photo is part of the current conditions that we looked at. We actually worked with 4 graduate students from UNR, the Geography Department, the Land Use Planning Program, who did an exhaustive photographic catalog of the corridor. So we had a lot to kind of baseline our future efforts off of. So this is kind of one that we point to. It's kind of one of the worst case scenarios in the corridor where it's literally a couple feet of sidewalk and just out of the foreground of this photo is a street lamp in the sidewalk to where you literally have to walk into the street to get around it. So there's just a huge opportunity for increasing opportunity for walkability on this corridor. The overall planning objectives, first and foremost, is to increase walkability in South Virginia. We talked about kind of this mixed bag of various widths or this non-existent sidewalk for that matter, and looked at how we could take those various widths and develop a programmatic hierarchy in order to address sidewalk improvements and streetscape improvements in a varied width situation. We integrated streetscape features into the transit services, developed an overall lighting master plan that ties in some of the efforts that have been done downtown, but at the same time creates an identity for the South Virginia corridor. Overall, throughout the corridor, we eliminated on-street parking, and the purpose of this was twofold. One, it increases the availability of sidewalk width so we can get a greater walkability, and then additionally, just the on-street parking is problematic for some of the bus rapid transit services going on. We did all this through a block-by-block analysis to identify overall what spaces are available. So I talked briefly there about the programmatic hierarchy. Here's kind of an image of what we're looking at for what would go into those existing areas where the building is really built up to the right-of-way and there's limited space available. So in Tier 1, really is just establishing that walkability, establish a sidewalk, perhaps some hardscape and lighting to tie in the corridor. Tier 2, you get a little bit more space. You're able to integrate street trees and benches and some of the street furniture. And then finally, Tier 3 really is required new development. And this is where we tie in to the existing South Virginia TOD code elements that the city of Reno currently has. So here's just a graphical representation of some of the elements that would be incorporated into the streetscape and the street beautification. We work with property owners and citizen groups to come up with a thematic street furniture palette for the corridor. We had various different themes that we presented to them. Two that came out as preferences were modern and then organic. So incorporating a lot of natural materials and things like that, and a lot of recycled materials that went into these street furniture. So just looking at some of the presentation type graphics that we presented to the public, here's kind of a rendering of what the corridor could look like with the improvements, in addition to a night scene showing kind of just the ambiance that can be created through the street lighting. We also did some before and afters. So this is the corner of Arroyo in South Virginia, and then looking at how those streetscape elements get incorporated, really changes the way those businesses look, and the hope is that it creates an atmosphere that patrons want to get out of their cars, take transit, spend time walking through the corridor instead of driving out in front of the business you want to go to, parking on the street, getting out and going on your way. So again, just some additional views of what the corridor may look like with these various elements. I also mentioned that we wanted to integrate the streetscape into the bus rapid transit, the terminals that are being planned. So what we did is we wanted to kind of provide some inspiration to other development opportunities in the corridor and really express the potential for developing adjacent to these transit stations and creating plazas and buildings that can capture those ridership that are getting off of these transit stations.
Thank you, Andy. Before I talk about the 3 projects that Stantec's had the opportunity to work with the RTC on, I thought I'd better talk about the one that the RTC actually initiated, which was they completed a transit signal priority project, which enabled them to determine which signal operations should actually be altered to have the greatest benefit on the Virginia Street corridor. So with the installation of fiber on Virginia Street, the RTC can actually adjust the signal prioritization to maintain efficient transit progression, which is really neat because that ties into the Q-Jump project. So what they do is they modify the intersections, and then Stantec had the opportunity to design the Q-Jump project, which took the right-of-way curve to curve, and we modified and allowed for designation of bus-only lanes. So the buses will have the opportunity to pull up to the intersection and then pass that waiting queue of traffic that's on Virginia Street. And then with different signal timing for the buses, they get a 5-second jump on the other traffic that's waiting in Virginia Street. So the buses have these actual transmitters that enable them to talk to the signals. So if they need to actually extend the length of the signal, they can extend that length so that they can maintain efficient flow of the bus transit through the Virginia Street corridor. Oh, I didn't show you, I'm sorry. I forgot about this part. Forgive me. It's hard when you can't see them. The next project that Stantec was involved with is what we call the bus rapid transit shelter design. The RTC actually has purchased these 60-foot-long articulated buses, and in conjunction with the Q-Jump project, that will enable them to reduce the travel time between downtown Reno and Meadowwood Mall. There are plans for 14 stations, 7 inbound and 7 outbound, including new improvements to the Meadowwood Mall transfer station. They've actually coined this new system on the next bus because there will no longer be a bus schedule associated with the rapid transit. The longest that any rider will have to wait is 10 minutes. So there's a 10-minute headway. So if you're waiting for the bus after 7 a.m., the longest you'll have to wait is 10 minutes. And before 7 a.m., it's 15 minutes. In designing the new bus rapid transit shelters, our landscape architect David Harding out of our Vancouver office, he looked to the local landscape palette for color and texture considerations. Of course, with the Truckee River and Lake Tahoe, we have plenty of shades of blue and green. And then being the high desert, we have lots of earth tones, browns and sage green from which to draw upon for some concepts. He also looked to our areas art and architecture for materials and forms when, in using the term from this morning, imagining our new concepts for the stations. With the Nevada Museum of Art in the upper right-hand corner, architect Will Bruder, who came to us from Phoenix, when he designed that building, he actually used vertical formwork. He envisioned a building rising up from the Black Rock Desert. I think he probably went to Burning Man all the time. He envisioned the building rising up from the black rock, so you see the vertical formwork there. The plaza itself has lots of metal, brushwork, brushed aluminum, and steel in the plaza. The new residential project 8 on Center Street has some horizontal line work in it. And we also see a lot of horizontal line work in the architecture, particularly on the Peppermill. We see it on the Atlantis. And we also see a lot of blues used as accent colors. Those, of course, appear on the 2 casinos I just mentioned, as well as on the Convention Center. And most recently, with the Silver Legacy, they've now illuminated it in blues to honor our UNR Wolfpack team. In the lower right-hand corner, you see the Olympic Village station that David also designed in downtown Vancouver, which I suspect he also used for inspiration on his designs for the bus rapid transit stations. These are the 2 concepts that we came up with. Option 1 includes a curving roof form and an undulating glass pattern as a reference to movement and wind in our area. The design includes some corrugated steel roof panels as well as a base plate. The top portion of the glazed walls will be constructed of perforated metal. Option 2 is a more minimalist approach with vertical glazing that's set in a random bar scale pattern, also expressing an alternating sense of movement. The idea was that this option would be very simple in its form and allow it to not compete with the surrounding context in which each of these shelters would be sited. The RTC selected option 1, which complements the rapid color palette and the movement motif that you see on its graphics. The photograph in the upper left is the rapid bus itself. The shelters will actually provide protection from the elements and the wind and the rain that we have here. The lengths of the stations are 53 feet to 72 feet. They all include 16-inch elevated platforms which will allow for level boarding from 2 different doors on the buses. There will be an off-board fare collection system that's via a vending machine, which enables the riders to actually load en masse rather than actually queuing up and climbing up the stairs and delaying the bus as it moves down the street. There'll be a digital reader board type of a display that will announce the arrival time of the bus, so people will no longer have to wonder when the bus is coming. They'll know exactly when it's due to arrive. The future actually will enable all of us to receive text messaging notifying us when the next bus is about to arrive. So if we actually work anywhere near the transit centers, we can run down there and stay at our offices and be as productive as possible, billable as possible, for as long as possible. And then finally, they'll all include some closed-circuit TV at all stations so that there's an enhanced sense of security. This is a visual simulation of the Orchard Plaza station. You can see in the bottom photograph that the intent is that they be well lit. The lighting will be reflective off of the ceiling, so it produces a sense of visual warmth. There'll also be low-level lighting along the sidewalk to reduce the shadows and enhance the design. This map shows where the proposed station locations will be. Starting from the lower right-hand corner, the first 2 would be at Meadowood Mall Way and opposite the Barnes & Noble Shopping Center. Moving north, we have 1 at the Convention Center and 1 opposite the Atlantis Casino. Further north, we have 2 right across the street, on both sides of the street at the Peppermill Casino. And then we have the Plum Lane or Orchard Plaza and then the vacant shopping center site. We have 2 at Mount Rose Street, 2 at the Mary and Center Street, and then finally the last 2 at California Avenue. And the very last project that Stantec has been involved with is the Meadowood Mall Transfer Station. This picture was just taken the other day. The contractor last week was out there putting the finishing touches on the site. The design really was intended to enhance the mobility around the area with a 16-foot wide island. Before, there were these large raised planters that included the trees and the landscaping, and while they might have been attractive, they actually impeded the mobility and created some confusion confusion when the buses would open and close for all the passengers getting on and off. So we cleaned all that up and put the trees in some tree grates, increased and provided new lighting. The little shelters that you see there are just the temporary shelters, new shelters that look very much like the shelters that will be put on Virginia Street will be installed at this location come spring. And that concludes my presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Gustafson, and I'm with Shields Oblex Johnson. With me is David Davies, who's going to participate with me in the presentation on the streetcar evaluation that's being conducted. Regional Transit RTC selected our firm, Shields Oblex Johnson. We partnered with Stantec Consulting Services and Eric Hovey, or E.D. Hovey and Company, an economist, and John Parker Consulting, a travel demand modeling company, to assist RTC in the city of Reno in evaluating the potential of converting the corridor of Virginia to a streetcar corridor. And we're going to talk to you just briefly about the streetcar and then give you an outline of some of the work we've done initially with regard to evaluating the corridor itself. As a little bit of a background, the Shields Oblex Johnson project management firm basically developed, built, designed, oversaw the design and now the operation of the Portland streetcar in Portland, Oregon that was introduced in 2001. And then we did a similar project designing, building, and setting up the operations for the streetcar in Seattle, the South Lake Union streetcar. And through both of those, we found that the streetcar as a higher quality transit service component did have an impact on the willingness of the private sector to develop at a higher density along the corridor. And from that, we were able to determine some of the impacts or improvements that occurred, primarily related around travel basis, walkability, and in creating that better or more compact urban form, that the transit and the quality of the transit service along that corridor is a critical element in making it possible for the market to call for such a higher density. And to that extent, with Eric Hovey, who did the studies in Portland and Seattle, we were able to quantify better what could happen in a corridor if you invested in a higher quality transit corridor as part of a total development strategy in the community. Get to the second one. So we started by evaluating the corridor that was suggested, and actually Virginia Street in Reno is well positioned for this kind of a longer term investment. It's a linear corridor. It already has significant ridership on it, with 5,500 riders a day. It has the ability to connect a good portion of the attractions. They're far enough away to require some kind of movement system, but they're all in a line, making it very conducive to being served by high quality transit. There are existing attractions, the university, as we see here today, over 8,000 hotel rooms, 500,000 square foot convention center space, the downtown, and a good portion of the other attractions in the community. Along with that, there is substantial additional development potential along the corridor. In essence, an ability to absorb a much larger population growth in this region while utilizing an existing and serviced corridor. In a community that's committed to mixed use and a higher density corridor, then the Virginia Street corridor is particularly well positioned for that. You went on, thank you, appreciate that. I have trouble keeping up with this. So, the Virginia Street corridor is identified already as a TOD corridor, or Transit Oriented Development Corridor. both in the regional plan and the city's master plan. This picture is that you see on the upper part is Portland, and 8 years ago that land was vacant. By supplying the transit corridor, the construction that happened, suggesting that 30-story condo towers always come out of streetcar projects, but this is an indication of the interrelationship between transit and development potential. And the development potential is more along the lines of, with the development that occurs, can you organize it in a fashion that is of higher density and a better mix of uses? Certainly the high quality transit serves these attractions, makes the connections, and it also can attract the high density growth. Next slide. The streetcar is a classification of electric transit. You've got light rail, and we'll show you a table on that, but light rail, streetcars in the definition in Portland operates in mixed traffic on the existing streets, doesn't operate in a separate right-of-way, which means it travels slower, but that they are easier to place in an urban setting. So not requiring that separate right-of-way and operating in mixed traffic makes it more possible for it to be imagined, say, in a mixed-use corridor like Virginia Street. Certainly with the modern cars, they're ADA accessible, which is a huge benefit and has had a huge impact on both the Portland and Seattle operations, which are experiencing just really phenomenal utilization by the accessibility community. It's clean and quiet electric power. It's easy to understand routes. We laughingly say we took the steering wheel away from the operator. And so the customer who gets on the streetcar knows where it's going to go. And it does reflect a permanent investment and a mutual commitment, both public and private. Next slide. We provided you some of the basics. Fundamentally, a light rail will traditionally be more of a regional transit, long distance travel accommodator. A streetcar is typically more of a circulator function, although it can be utilized. It goes up to 45 miles an hour. And with the proper right-of-way and so forth, it would seem it could apply very effectively here on the street in Virginia as a rapid streetcar, along with it serving the circulator function. Next slide. And then there are choices that communities have made, and David will talk to you about these choices. Some cities in the United States have selected a historic car to return to that history of 100 years ago when streetcars dominated and built most of our cities in the country, to the modern streetcar, which is seen more in Europe, now seen in the United States. And Portland introduced the first light rail or streetcar, modern streetcar system. Seattle followed. Tacoma has built one. Washington, D.C. is under construction. And we'll talk a little bit more about the other cities that are considering it, all really for the similar reasons of accommodating the higher density development.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. So I just thought I'd go back quickly and, that one, just to note that building in the back and the streetcar operating in its environment. The building in the background is a new condominium development in Portland, and just kind of helps to set the scene to talk about how streetcars operate in an urban environment. And this slide here is the corridor, the Virginia Street corridor, and on the upper end is UNR, and on the lower end is the Meadowood Mall. So you have that 5-6 mile corridor laid out, and these are the existing attractions that you would like to link up along the corridor. And what we did is, for the economic analysis, we then laid on top of that the potential development sites along the corridor, and but potential development sites we define as either vacant land or properties where the land value exceeds the improvement value. So the existing improvements are really pretty low, and it's really a site you'd like to see accept some of the more density and more development for the area. And then the next slide shows actually the proposed or planned developments that are in discussion. Obviously, the last couple of years, the economy has taken a hit to some of these projects, but there's a number of large projects proposed for the corridor, and a streetcar and a major public investment could be something that could help with financing for a project, or even just really help the city think about how it's going to grow, how it's going to link its potential projects and serve the existing and future attractions. So what we did is look at cities around the country that have streetcar alignments and really look at the new development and private investment that has occurred in those cities. And you can see, smaller cities like Little Rock up to larger cities, Portland and Seattle, Tampa, have experienced large amounts of development. Seattle has experienced over $3 billion in development just along the lines of the streetcar in over 4 years. So you look at what we wanted to do also is break that down. You see these large numbers of development, and of course it's not all attributable to streetcars, but you get a sense that you see it in city after city that really there is something to this major public investment and it attracting development. And so what we did is break down private investment per mile and per mile per year, and you get a sense that really the development community is paying attention, and they notice that this major public investment is really a pretty good place to invest their own money. This is an interesting slide. Basically, the taller green columns show post streetcar development. So the red is development before the streetcar was built, and the green is development after. And as you on the left side is closer to the streetcar line. So within one block of the streetcar line in Portland, what we've seen is that development has occurred at over 90% of the allowed density. So you're getting higher quality, higher density development right next to the streetcar line. But before the streetcar was built, it was closer to 30% of the allowed density. And then as you get further away from the streetcar line, 2, 3, and 3 blocks, that effect is much less pronounced. So at greater than 3 blocks in the city of Portland, we've kind of seen a across the board development to about 40% of the allowed development density. So pretty dramatic statistic when you look at what Portland has seen. So when we looked at the Virginia Street corridor, we looked at basically 2 zones. We have a zone A, which is close to the alignment, so within 500 feet, and then zone B, between 500 and 1,000 feet. And some stops, depending on how the southern corridor would be serviced, if it was more like the existing bus rapid transit service, you'd have stops spaced further apart, so the zone A's and B's may not touch each other. But then in the downtown area, we assume that the stops would be closer together and have a more continuous flow of that zone A. So the projection of future development, looking 20 years out, what we saw based on existing land use patterns and development patterns is basically over 20 years, you can expect to see about $500 million worth of development along that corridor, within a few blocks of Virginia Street. And then with the streetcar, we projected that there would be a premium, and that premium would be about $1 billion. So you'd see about $1.5 billion total over 20 years, and that $1 billion would be made up of something like over 4,000 residential units, almost 7.5 million square feet of commercial development, which would result then in $60 million worth of property tax revenues. So these are based on, again, that those zones A and B and what we've seen in other cities around the country. So in zone A, we projected the development would be about 4.5 times the baseline development. Zone B, about 1.5 times. In Portland, we actually saw in zone A, it was over 6 times the rate within one block. So again, you see this pattern of development, and then you want to be able to project that in other cities and in Reno and along the corridor. So what does this investment mean for the community at large in terms of a public investment, and how could you expect to see a return on your investment in transit? And when you look at other cities and the development that they've seen and track the private investment along the alignment, we've got a range of returns on investment. You know, Seattle is 61 times the investment, $3.2 billion at an initial capital cost of $52 billion. Whereas Little Rock is a longer alignment at 3.4 miles, and they've only seen $400 million of development. So you see a wide range. Reno's projected return on investment, we're looking at six times the initial investment.
The connector along the downtown to convention center, a real value in the community about linking the hotel rooms together with a convention center to make it more effective and long-term value in the community. That service would operate very similar to the Rapid with more distant stops connecting to the convention center. And then finally, the connection to the Meadowwood Mall completes the corridor. The good news is that the federal government has begun to endorse the concept of sustainability and livability and support projects that are more oriented toward mixed-use developments. And in the last 12 months, the Federal Transit Administration, through the various programs it has funded 12 streetcar projects in the United States. And their record prior to the last 12 months is not a single project was funded in the United States. So there's been a rather stark turnaround and change, with over $400 million allocated to streetcar projects in the country. And federal grants do require local match, but the federal government, through its sustainability and livability program, have declared that the projects like this, where you place an emphasis on quality and the connection between the transit investment and the land use, get a priority out of the administration. And finally, Reno has a corridor with strong development potential. You have a high transit utilization already, and there's cooperation between the development interests of the city and the mobility interests of RTC. So those end up being enormous assets for a community as you begin to pursue a strategy that really calls for your land use and your transportation investments to be effectively coordinated. And there's a big payoff for that. And then the next steps for us is to determine the service and phasing, prepare for the local finance plan, and then assure federal eligibility. And what I close with is keep in mind that the primary contribution to both the sustainability and livability for a transit project like this is in supporting and making livable a land use pattern that is a more compact urban form, a much greater emphasis on mixes of uses rather than separation of uses. And the real payoff in that is in the trip reduction. So that a family that lives in a mixed-use environment in Portland, we know, will average 9 vehicle miles a day traveled per person. That same family living in a suburban environment with poor transit and low walkability will average 22 miles per day in vehicle miles traveled. So a dramatic change in their travel behavior, not forced by anyone, but allowed by the fact that many uses are adjacent to the property, to the place where they live.
Thank you. Can I get you to click to the next one? There we go. Okay, what we're at the point now is where these two corridors come together just south of us here in downtown. And that's a key activity center for our region. These are a few pictures of the intermodal concepts as they exist or are planned in certain areas. The slides on the left, the three slides, are the new Trans-Bay Terminal, 5 levels, all different modes coming together that has received federal funding in San Francisco. The slide in the top right is the Milwaukee train and bus and transit intermodal center, and the one on the bottom right is Durham. The reason I point that out is we've got an opportunity with these two corridors coming together to do something in addition to what we're doing on the two corridors, to do something really dramatic with the transportation, the different forms of transportation that come together in downtown Reno, as well as all the major events facilities. So realizing that opportunity, we asked Steve to come down and talk about the project that he started on the Transportation Event Center before we moved to the East 4th Prater.
Thank you, John. This is probably good like this. I got to say, if I was known I'm going to be dead center, I probably would have showed up today. Plus the light come out the head, I apologize now. As John mentioned, we're just embarking on a project with the city here, and Kyle's actually the project manager, so this is the first public opportunity for you to see that we can actually get along. So there'll be more of these, and you guys make sure you get involved in this process because it's really exciting for the city of Reno. Basically, my name is Steve Knoll, Design Workshop. We're a landscape architecture and urban design firm. Our office is up at State Line, Nevada. We were selected recently to help basically to look at how some of the elements that were talked about by previous speakers here, the transit piece, would then provide that energy, and then once you have arrived to this area in transit, then how would that pedestrian then basically embark in the entire community. This slide just tells you the three major points I'm going to be addressing here shortly. And to give you kind of a context of the project, it's loosely defined by 2nd Street, South Virginia, 4th Street, and Evans. And we say loosely because in this process we'll be looking at some of the connectivity, some important ones obviously to the university itself, which is it isn't necessarily down the corridor that the automobile necessarily travels. So it provides some opportunity to look at this on a larger scale. So thinking about those two components, transit being the most critical one, we'll be really looking at the existing facilities in place. With the recently opened 4th Street station, if you haven't been down there yet, it's a phenomenal facility. That's in place. You have the Amtrak, so you have that going on. So you actually have a lot of the aspects of providing the access from afar to this area. And similarly along taking the events in mind, make sure I'm on the right slide. There's a lot going on here already. With the bowling alley, with the Reno Event Center, the recent addition of the Aces baseball stadium, and of course there's a number of plazas and open space areas. If you ever take a chance to walk down, that really, as you have seen, come alive during the events. But then how do they fit into the overall program? So really thinking about these two aspects. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the attributes of a good community. Historically, cities have been built around trade centers. We've seen a lot of cities from industrial startups have evolved into cities. So there's been both this working element that established cities. More recent with the intervention of all the technologies such as Silicon Valley, those cities have evolved out of basically the manufacturing production of something. What great cities, then they become communities, and what you do with that is you really start to embrace the residents and the people that live and breathe on a daily basis in there, because as we all know, if you've been to any place to travel, you want to go where the people that live and enjoy their spaces. So bringing the community back down to downtown Reno in this area is really important, and will be really the focus of this project. There are a number of attributes that we'll be looking at. The highlight, the three at the bottom that I've circled there, are really the focus we'll be putting some emphasis on. The first one being economic. The second one is really the accessibility and mobility. And so I'm in between glasses and screens, so it's a little squinty here. And then finally looking at the community character, some of the recreation and leisures, and also the cultural attractions that really make up Reno. So when you look at the economic stability of communities, you know, it's even to be stable right now is a pretty impressive position to be in. So, but we're in this process, we're not necessarily looking at the quick fix, we're looking at the short-term and long-term aspects. So working with the city will be understanding some of the economic opportunities they have in order to provide some sort of revenue back into this area to make these projects happen. As you know, it will most likely, as just previously spoken about, the public-private ventures that really make them come alive, but also how the public takes the lead in providing the best foot forward and what the community would like to see. Access and mobility. I think transportation we talked about, but when you think about Southwest acquiring their recent addition of airline back east, the number of flights that may potentially come here, I don't know where the train track is, the double-stack train track coming from San Francisco past Truckee, but once you depart the commerce, I mean the shipping from the travel by train, you can only imagine the number of people coming here. So you can see all the I-580 and go on and on about how all roads lead to Reno, so to speak. But transit mobility and having that international, national, and local connection is really key. Mentioned earlier, successful communities are really a reflection of the residents that reside there, the businesses that reside there, and really the attitude that you have there. So really having the ability to walk around this area and find out what makes up this town, what makes up this district, and providing some sort of attitude or structure how we could best present that to the greater audience will be important to be looking at. Recreation and leisure events. Boy, there's a lot going on. There really is. When you think about if you ever go to other cities and just take a snapshot and see what events happen throughout the year, you'd be amazed how many Reno has on a weekly basis, or just about every weekend starting in, probably, well, I think even in March. I mean, there are, I'm just overwhelmed. So there's already the venue to start that. This is just enhancing that and making it much stronger so that we'll really open up this area to a larger audience. And then finally, looking at those two aspects and saying, okay, how do they come together? It really comes down to the culture and the historic aspects of the city, in this case, Reno. And so leveraging those community elements, understanding that the thing evolved out of necessity and out of a choice, and drawing off of that will be really important that we highlight those and keep moving those forward as this project progresses. So with that in mind, I'm going to just give a little bit of overview about the scope of work we'll be embracing here in the next, how long is the project? Okay, for about a year. So we'll have some time to get this to work, but this is really what the project's going to be about. Two key points. It's really to enhance the streetscape experience, creating a cohesive, interconnected transportation and event center. The two need to go hand in hand. Second is to incorporate a bigger picture and build off the framework of the ReTrack corridor plan, which was a pretty extensive document that the city went through a few years back, and that is really a building block to come from, and to create the framework that allows for continued growth and placemaking. So the corridor development that was just discussed is really one of the key elements to keep in mind, the available land, so to speak. So with any project, we'll start out with project goals. We have some that we kind of put on the table, and we'll continue to develop these early along in the process. And this isn't just us. This will be really part of a pretty extensive public outreach, getting stakeholders in mind around the table, work with the city. So it's really going to be a reflection of what the goals of those stakeholders and the public have in mind for this. 3 areas in which we'll be looking at will be tourism, the opportunities there, development plan recommendations for some of the alternatives, and then finally looking at some implementation outcomes. So this project was intended to be looking at a planning initially, but actually have a project come out of it that was be put into the ground so the city can, the residents and the city can see the results of the effort. And so looking at the approach of the tourism, you know, we mentioned this is a tourist destination, always will be. What that tourist looks like is changing, as we know, with gaming having a different position in the community, but also recognizing that Reno has done a real nice job about realizing that and moving toward a well-mixed, which previous slide I had before, of that diversity of interest, businesses, and residents is important. So with that, we're going to be coming up with some alternatives. This will be looking at different things that will help tie this together, whether it's wayfinding, it could be improvements to a street area, looking at the use of the city center, which is an available piece of land. So looking at some of the city's holdings and see what would be the best opportunities for those, so that we can actually have some designs that are evolved out of that, and we can bring those to the public and they can have an opportunity to give some feedback. And then with that, we basically have our, these are just 3 lists of the different types of projects that might evolve out of that. So in this effort, it could be what would the city center site be reused as a community benefit, or it could be a variety of ideas, streetscape enhancements to maybe a couple streets that are connect A to B type of thing. So on the planning level, it provides the overall framework, but then this will actually show an actual project that we implemented. So in conclusion, I will read these. Really projects that will help, that we should really keep assessing when we think about things that will benefit Reno. They need to meet the needs and the changing demographics. That's a pretty obvious but a difficult one at times because we just don't know where it's going. I got to say though that the Chamber and those Congress did a great job of keeping on their fingers on where things are moving. Emphasize the environmental values. Reno has some phenomenal attributes, the river, the mountains, all of those things are really important to recognize as a visitor. You have to embrace those and present those. You want authentic places to be here, not Disneyland type things. You need to deliver the recreation and entertainment opportunities on a regular and a predictable time frame. Exhibit community character and spirit. That's done with your art town and all the things that the city has done. Recognize the total community. Integrate the natural and the built environment, really critical. You need to have memorable icons and architecture, so embrace those things that are true to your heart. Vibrant community, and last but not least, recreate what is missing from the lives of those who live here. With that, I'll pass it on to Kyle.
Thank you. I'm Kyle West, Engineering Manager for City of Reno Community Development. We've heard a lot about the proposed redevelopment along the Virginia Street corridor, but the 4th Street Prater Way Todd corridor, which connects Reno and Sparks, is also a key component of our regional transit system. For the past 10 years, the City of Reno has focused significant resources on stimulating redevelopment along 4th Street between Evans Avenue and the East City limits. The Regional Master Plan, completed during 2006, identified 4th Street as an area offering ample opportunities for redevelopment and mixed-use projects. ReTrack Master Plan, a 2006-2007 comprehensive study of areas bordering Union Pacific Railroad, which of course runs east to west and is south of 4th Street. Also included 4th Street and analyzed placement of housing, retail, alternative transportation, open space, parks, public spaces, as well as commercial development, and made recommendations for future development. On this chart, basically what I've got is this area in yellow represents some mixed-use areas. These in the blue are projects such that already exist within this corridor, starting with the Aces Ball field here. We've got housing as well as the courtyard in this area. In 2006, the city designated 4th Street as a TOD corridor and is now following through on objectives of the TOD as well as the master plan by investing in construction of infrastructure that will promote transportation and redevelopment. From 2004 to 2007, the city secured more than $1.2 million in federal grants from the U.S. Departments of Transportation as well as HUD to install new lighting, construct new wider ADA compliant sidewalks, and beautify the 4th Street corridor. These infrastructure improvements supported new affordable housing and private developments along 4th Street in Reno and Prayer Way in Sparks. And as of this date, almost $40 million have been invested to create affordable housing opportunities. We've got a number of great units that have been developed throughout this corridor. Recently, a number of redevelopment projects have added momentum to our revitalization of 4th Street. The most recent projects include the recently completed 4th Street station, which any of you that are going to go on this mobile tour with us, you get that opportunity to see that new bus station. And located at the corner of Lake and 4th Street. And then we have phases 1 and 2 of the Freight House District that have been recently completed. Phase 1 of the district is basically the baseball field, which is now home to the Aces. And phase 2 is the retail and restaurants that have been completed just to the north of the baseball field. These portions of the Freight House District were completed in began development in 2007 and been completed this year. We do have additional phases of this Freight House District, which includes the ground floor of the bowling stadium, as well as the city center site, which is in this area of our corridor. The city center being the former bus station, and like Steve said, we're going to be taking a look at what we're going to use that facility for. In addition to future redevelopment within the Freight House District, additional development along the 4th Street corridor includes a number of industrial facilities which will add sustainability to our community. This area, this is the industrial arts area. And what we found is that existing buildings and architectural elements of buildings within this area support the concept of an industrial arts district, an area where various artists can come together and produce art and other industrial projects for the region. One of the most exciting things that we're looking at now is this area here identified as an eco-industrial park here in this area. Due to the existing location of the waste management facilities and desire expressed by several alternative energy companies and recycling businesses who want to purchase land here in Reno, this area was designated by our city council to support development of recycling and alternative energy facilities. We are currently negotiating with a number of entities for the purchase of properties within this district which supports this concept. Thank you.
I'm Jim Rundle. I'm going to take a minute to talk about the city that hasn't been mentioned much today, the city of Sparks. A place where the grass is always a little greener. I want you to walk away from today's discussion thinking about a few things regarding transit-oriented development. We're going to talk about today in our presentation how we're working at Sparks towards implementing transit-oriented development and the challenges facing transit-oriented development, not just in the city of Sparks, but essentially anywhere in Nevada. In 2002, the regional plan required for master planning transit-oriented development. Sparks amended its master plan in 2002 to include goals and policies promoting transit-oriented development. In 2006, Sparks approved implementing zoning standards to implement those goals and policies in the master plan. Through the master planning effort that began in 2007, Sparks began creating updated development standards Ultimately, those development standards were approved in 2009. Refinements in those original zoning standards were necessary after we spent some windshield time driving the TOD and walking the TOD. We also had a number of public input meetings where we received a lot of input from citizens living in the TOD. Some examples that are reflected on this slide here are removing some of the single-family residential neighborhoods out of the TOD, and also designating the corridor with different standards. As you can see reflected up here, we had 4 areas that we distinguished as having their own character. There's a number of different colors on the map where we believe they should have standards different from other areas. So we tried to tailor the standards to each different neighborhood. As we work with Reno and the RTC on the East 4th and Prater Way corridor, we will study and continue to refine our BRT route.
Good afternoon, I'm Armando Ornelas, City Planner for the City of Sparks. So in addition to responding to the regional plan, what were some of the things that Sparks was trying to accomplish with its TOD Master Plan and Development Standards? One was essentially to ease the regulatory process so that projects could essentially not have to go through any master plan amendment, rezoning, and in any case, special use permit process, and really go either to site plan review or straight to building permit. In terms of the guiding principles for the Sparks COD quarter, there were 4 that were identified. One was to promote downtown Sparks as the civic and cultural heart of Sparks. In many cases, at Sparks, we talked about it being a living room for Sparks. Second was to provide for vibrant mixed-use centers. Third, to provide for high-quality, context-sensitive development. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then to revitalize and to build our neighborhoods along that corridor.
Above are some examples of what ultimately we hope to get from transit-oriented development in the city of Sparks. What we're looking for is context-sensitive buildings, as reflected on the slides above. You can see we have standards that are promoting buildings being along the street frontage, and that would promote parking in the rear of the buildings. We're also looking at, on this slide, better walkability, wider sidewalks with landscape buffers. And then also in addition, we have street parking here. Those types of buffers make areas more attractive to walk in. If you've ever walked along the street, Prater Way is a great example. 35 miles an hour, 4-foot wide sidewalk, about 2 feet away is traffic driving right next to you. It's not a comfortable feeling. An example of some more development that we're hoping for at Sparks. Once again, the wider sidewalks, landscape buffer, street parking. Attached over here is a depiction of walkability, essentially having accessibility through developments. Many times you have an apartment complex or development get constructed on too many blocks, and it essentially cuts off walkability through areas, whereas you have to walk around an entire development just to get to where you're going. Maybe it should be 400 yards and it turns into half a mile to 3/4 of a mile.
One of the aspects of the regional plan that we really gave a lot of thought to and struggled with was the regional plan's requirements to have average and minimum residential densities. And in the downtown quarters, the downtown centers, the average density is supposed to be 45 dwelling units per acre with a minimum of 30. Outside of that, it would be 30 and 18 respectively. Again, as Jim said, as we drove the area and walked the neighborhoods and really received feedback from the public, we came to realize that a lot of that was probably not going to be acceptable to our community in the short term, and that we needed to essentially work up to it. So what we did in terms of our plan was to propose lower minimum densities of 24 units in the center and Victorian Square area, 18 outside of that, with the provision that in 5 years we would revisit those densities and see if it was realistic to move them up.
We appreciate the plan, as Armando said, the goals and policies in the regional plan, because they are making the area, the 3 jurisdictions work toward a better Truckee Meadows. As Armando said, we had to tailor the standards to work more appropriately for the city of Sparks in the current economic times. We tried to be responsive to this in the master planning effort. As Armando said, and I said earlier, we drove each street. We realized that one of the most important factors to writing the TOD standards was providing context-sensitive design so that we got good projects. We wanted to take a pragmatic approach and encourage lot consolidation. We wanted to look at things such as graduated density. And ultimately what we found was by having the context-sensitive design, we were able to get more public support for our projects, or for our proposal. What I want to point out on this slide is an illustration of a new project coming in that's 2 stories, probably 4 to 8 units. Neighboring the new project is an existing single-family residence that's probably been there since 1930. When we explained to the citizens that we were going to be requiring buffering or stepping down of larger buildings as they came up close to the existing single-family residential, we were able to get a lot of support. Maybe not so much because of the exact standards that we were proposing, but because we were reflecting that we did care about what was there and who was there. A testament to what I'm saying is when we took the project forward to the Sparks City Council, we rezoned approximately 2,500 acres in the city of Sparks, or about a quarter of the entire city of Sparks. There wasn't one person there contesting the approval of the zoning or any of the development standards or the master plan. This is an illustration of graduated density. As you can see here, we have a 3-story building that ultimately was constructed at 42 units. I talked earlier about the graduated density approach. The way the standards work in Sparks right now is this parcel, which was formerly 4 parcels, would be allowed to have 2 units on each parcel. But when you consolidate the 4 parcels and get a larger area for 1 parcel, you are allowed substantially higher density. This ultimately encourages citizens or property owners to work together, consolidate, and provide bigger projects and get ultimately more density. As you've heard up to this point is a high necessity to promote the transit system.
So as we look ahead and we grapple with how we successfully implement our TOD master plan and put our standards to work, we've considered a number of things. One, of course, is the availability of transit. And I think that, while in a few cases there is lots of right-of-way, that is more often than not the case. We have an opportunity potentially along the Audi Boulevard corridor to work with RTC in Reno and to take that corridor, which was formerly a state highway and where there's lots of right-of-way, and do some things that we probably don't have the opportunity necessarily to do along Virginia Street, as was indicated in Andy Gerling's presentation, or necessarily along the Predator portion of the East 4th Street Predator route. Obviously, the transit has to be reliable, it has to be convenient, it has to be funded, both in terms of capital projects and the operations. One of the things that we've given some thought to is the potential displacement of automobile traffic off the BRT corridors onto surrounding streets, and so how do we deal with that? And then, of course, there's the question of motor priorities, and in a true TOD project, we would typically favor pedestrian, bicycles, public transit, and then cars in that order.
Here's an illustration of something that I get pretty excited about when it comes to TOD in the city of Sparks. Sparks was really fortunate to work with the RTC last year to complete this complete street approach. You can see here we have a wider sidewalk with a buffer of landscaping, buffered by a bicyclist lane that also receives a buffer from the traffic. This illustration also reflects the Sparks BRT corridor. As you see the bus heading westbound, probably towards Centennial Plaza in Sparks, ultimately probably back over to the city of Reno along the Crater 4th Street corridor. Ultimately, we hope to continue to work with RTC to connect this complete street approach over to the Sparks Marina, which would connect Victorian Square to the marina.
So obviously, the long-term goal is to attract private investment to the TOD corridor, to our downtown center. Towards that end, obviously, there has to be investment on the part of the public sector to support that and to help attract that investment. The City of Sparks continues to make improvements in the Victorian Square area. The city has been funding pedestrians and streetscape improvements along Crater Way, Victorian Avenue, and some of the adjacent neighborhoods using both our Community Development Block Grant and NDOT enhancement funding. Our redevelopment agency board just directed staff to move forward with developing priorities for this type of improvement with agency funds in some of those older neighborhoods between Crater and Victorian. And as Jim has noted, we've been fortunate to be able to work with RTC on the complete street treatment along Victorian Avenue, which he showed you the photo of, and hopefully over the next couple of years on the East 4th Street and Crater Way project with Reno and RTC, and then also on the Boulevard. One of the questions that we'll have to tackle as part of the East 4th Crater BRT route is just where that route runs through Sparks. In our master plan, it was shown as a loop. We have the consideration that, in fact, there are some key facilities and attractions that are actually not located along the Crater route. One of them, of course, is the Centennial Plaza transit facility that RTC completed here recently. It's a beautiful facility, but it's not on Crater. It's actually on Victorian Avenue. We have Victorian Square and Legends, and so I think that's obviously a key aspect of the scope of work for that East 4th Crater BRT study. In terms of some of the challenges, we talked about having to raise the densities over time to comply with the original plan and to support the transit function. There's always that bit of a chicken and egg issue with transit and density, which comes first. Obviously, ideally like to move forward and make both commitments at the same time, but the commitment on the part of density is ultimately by and large on the part of the private sector. There's obviously some challenges in terms of demand on the market side. We have we're not in a position where there's strong demand for any type of real estate development at the present time. Hopefully that will change in the near future, but unfortunately it may stick around for a few years at least based on the state demographer's most recent projections. One of the things that has to be considered is that typically this type of development in the urban core is more expensive to construct than a more suburban style development along the or out on greenfield sites, at least when you don't take into account some of the costs in that suburban environment that many times aren't factored into the equation. And I know that one of the challenges with this more dense type of development is that when you try to build to a higher floor area ratio, you have challenges having to do with having to provide structured parking, for example, which is much more expensive. Site assembly, always a challenge. And then, of course, we've had some challenges with projects that look to go forward in the TOD area, but can't meet the standards, and effectively we're having to say no. So that's a tough thing in this environment in particular.
Okay. Hello, I'm Christina Leach. I'm a transportation planner for the RTC. And the RTC is currently working with staff from the cities of Reno and Sparks to do a corridor study for the 4th Street and Crater Way The study will focus on developing a multimodal analysis for transportation improvements. It will for improvements along the corridor. In regard to bicycles and pedestrians, it will address bicycle storage facilities, connectivity, and ADA accessibility. For transit, the study will look at short and long-range improvements such as queue jumps and transit signal priority improvements that could be considered for potential bus rapid transit and indoor streetcars. Also, the study will address roadway and traffic improvements. Another outcome of the study will be an economic analysis of the redevelopment potential in the corridor. It will investigate the coordination between land use and transportation, as well as consider the social and economic aspects of the corridor. Finally, opportunities to incorporate art and preserve the historic nature of the roadway will be identified. To achieve this aspect of the project, RTC is partnering with the University of Nevada, Reno, and Sierra Arts to develop projects that will enhance the corridor through the inclusion of art and identification of historical buildings with potential for adaptive reuse and preservation. The RFP for this study will be released in January 2011, and we are anticipating that the study will begin in May of 2011. That's about it for that.
Okay, I want to thank all of our panelists from Sparks and that other city. A lot of good presentations, and I think you can see how we're trying to improve mobility, livability, and the economy. A bunch of different agencies, public and private, folks working together in an interdisciplinary approach, trying to make the regional plan real.